when they discovered the 6 bodies beneath our living room floor. I was 16 years old. I'm not one to divulge personal details, partly because I tend to run my mouth and say too much. But that night stays with me. Usually, as I'm crawling into bed, I am somewhere between blurry alertness and heavy sleep. To be honest, I've never been a really good sleeper. At night, I'm most productive. As a result, I spend a lot of time staring up at the ceiling, wondering if tonight will be the night when I divulge all the nasty details to some reporter wanting to make it big. But then I remember, the media has already had their fill of my family, and right or not, their eager reporting got my name in the history books by the time I was 17. If I had to put the record straight, it would go something like this. I can't get that sound out of my head. It's one of the most unsettling aspects of that night, something I can't ignore, and it has followed me throughout my life. It was a hand beating on our front door repeatedly. It sent shockwaves down to the tips of my toes. I broke out in a cold sweat when I realized the swirl of blue and red lights outside my window, combined with the beating at the door, could only mean one thing. The cops were on their way. My mother, who was known for sleeping through almost everything, dashed into the corridor, and I could see her standing at the top of the stairs, hand to chest, through the breach in my door. She was dressed in her favorite silky pink nightgown, the kind that brushed against the floor as she moved. When she wore it, she appeared to be floating, but it dragged behind her in a rage at the time. My fear didn't keep my curiosity at away, so I hopped out of bed and padded toward the door. I gazed out, anticipating what would happen next. My mother's voice was the first to shatter the heavy hush. She asked, "What is it, and what do you want?" Then came a jumbled string of statements about my father, where he was, my mother wondering if he was in an accident, and a forceful voice demanding who was home. My mother's anguish rose another octave. She demanded that they summon their commanding officer so that she may speak with him or her personally. I'd never seen her so enraged before. I glanced over the railing to see the 2 officers in the foyer, one on either side of my mother. My mother screamed, "You have no right." One of the officers said something to her in hushed tones. Then she summoned me and my younger brother, Rob. I didn't want to go down those steps. When the cops are involved, awful things always happen, and I wasn't prepared for my unfortunate finish. "It's fine," he responded, raising his hand to us and motioning us to the landing. I took the first step down with my brother under my arm and walked straight into hell. They ambushed my father as soon as he walked through the door, tackling him. He hadn't even noticed the 2 patrol cars parked outside because he'd spent the previous few hours downing gin and tonics. I crept around the corner, down the hall, and positioned myself outside the kitchen door while Robbie was watching TV in the living room. For some reason, the cops decided that the best spot to question him would be where we ate our meals. "Tell me where the bodies are," one of the officers said. "I'm not sure," my father said. But his voice betrayed him. He couldn't conceal his trembling. "Do you even have a warrant to be here?" A growl of incomprehensible words followed. My mother's name. She'd seen far too many Law Order episodes in her time. "It's a reasonable search with probable cause," the second officer added, his voice much deeper. "You don't need one when you're a direct threat to our community." "You're familiar with me. You're familiar with my family," my father replied, his voice stumbling over the word family. "For God's sake," shouted my mother, "don't say anything else, James. We need our lawyer." To me, we're all aware of the type of work you do, and, given the circumstances, I can't turn a blind eye just because we're friends. I told folks who couldn't understand the industry lingo that my father was a scientist, but to those who knew him and his work at the university, he was a forensic and human sciences expert. To be more specific, criminal forensics. He spent his days teaching others about chemical compounds, cleaning and appraising dead bodies, and evidence preservation techniques. He was a terrific man and a fantastic teacher. I'd know because I'm his child, and he showed me everything. But if anyone knew how to dispose of a corpse, it was him. 7 university students had gone missing in the previous year. 4 of them were enrolled immediately in his graduate forensics seminar. The same faces that had shown on the evening news had appeared in our home. They hung out on our front porch. They drank beer or wine while talking about local murder scenes. They dined at our table. I was studying in our backyard hammock, which was suspended between two willow trees. He was even observed having fun with students during happy hours. If it wasn't already evident, my father adored his students. They were adored. He treated them as if they were his children, even though they weren't. "Did you honestly believe no one would notice, Jimmy?" an officer inquired. "Everyone had noticed," I reasoned. "How could you possibly not? They begged you to tell us. They claimed it was time. What happened to them? We must bring them home. You don't have to keep this a secret any longer, Jimmy." Even though it's been 20 years since that night, I have to say that their assurance in that moment still makes my blood boil. They were so certain of their charge, yet had so little evidence to back it up. Because, let's face it, a close relationship with a pupil is a rather shaky thread to tie someone to murder. Unfortunately, my father had reached the end of his ability to keep secrets. "They're beneath the living room floor," he explained. I stumbled forward, tumbling onto the kitchen floor. I'd forgotten how frail that door was, and I'd be willing to pay a high price for my curiosity, because I could feel the weight of his attention on me even as I stared down at the black and white tiles, attempting to be invisible. When I looked up, our gazes were locked. I couldn't push my lungs to expand, thus I couldn't breathe. That was the end of it. This was the moment I knew would come to an end. The only thing I needed to know was from his gaze. The media has bent and twisted the circumstances of that night. So many tales, so little truth. Which is paradoxical given that the news is meant to adhere to the greatest standards of accuracy. But I think I should be gracious to them. They're only human, and humans make mistakes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My father never said anything else. At the police station, no. Nowhere throughout the trial, and certainly not to me. My last minutes with my father were spent watching as the cops dismantled my boyhood house, while 6 bodies were retrieved from the depths of our foundation. What's the funniest thing? His gaze shifted from guilt to shock, and it made me wonder, did he not anticipate this outcome? Isn't this the finale he hoped for? My mother leaving him, our home being torn apart, his daughter's presence as it all unfolded. Was he concerned about the woman I'd become if he was convicted? I had a lot of questions. One crucial question, but I wouldn't be able to ask it that night. Only 3 weeks passed before a jury found him guilty. The fingerprints, clothes fibers, and driver's licenses found in our basement were enough to sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of release. And the papers grumbled that my father was the sloppiest, yet most brilliant, murderer our town had ever seen. He acted as if he wanted to be discovered. According to one journalist, he was the only educated, well-versed scientist with a flair for murder and juvenile blunders. He couldn't have cleaned up the spilled milk. To be clear, my father was not a moron. He was neither childlike nor rash. He was gentle, warm, and demanding. He was always there in my life, attending every parent-teacher conference, soccer event, and choir concert. He was interested in my interests and encouraged me to try anything and everything, even if it was a little strange. For example, when I mentioned that I wanted a taxidermy kit, he promptly purchased one for me. He was a wonderful father. It's not a monster. He was solely guilty of spending an increasing amount of time with his students. He got to the point where he was missing family dinners and school functions. Then there are birthdays. But the tabloids aren't interested in hearing about the pleasant shit. They seek the most heinous aspects of a family tragedy. They demand to be told about the red flags, the late nights, how he guarded the nuances of his employment, treating the specifics of his day job like a valuable piece of blown glass. They were curious about the evenings my father caught me in his lab, snooping around and playing with his chemicals and gadgets, or the terror in his eyes when he spotted me in his sacred area, a location I was never permitted to explore on my own. Or perhaps they were more interested in how he disliked it when I spent too much time with his students, how I asked so many questions and became too close to young men twice my age. That detail would almost certainly have made it into the tabloids. But I was never granted a press interview. I never told anyone about my upbringing or what remained of it after my mother fell into a catatonic despair and my brother moved in with my uncle. Given how quickly people turned on my father and how dramatically my life had disintegrated, I reasoned that keeping a tight lip was the best way to stay under the radar. And when I was 18, I relocated to an entirely different coast. I renamed myself. I had my hair dyed. I created a new life for myself. However, a new identity does not remove the truth. It can't extinguish biology or erase the girl who was, is. In situations like this, history cannot be avoided, and my past beckoned to me. Time and time again, even when I married, had 2 children, and started a new work as a physician's assistant, I couldn't stop thinking about my previous life. I was Jennifer before I became Jennifer. After 20 years, I still had that nagging question. After one trip and a 35-minute Uber ride, I was standing right outside the jail where the guy I once called a father was being kept. I couldn't be sure he'd agree to see me after all those years without saying anything. But then I remembered the man he was, how much he liked being a father, and how much he loved me. I forced myself to move and pushed open the door. I went to the visitor's desk and waited. I waited for the guard to come out and say he'd see me later. Hours went by without a word, which eroded my confidence. But as I was ready to stand up and leave, the door opened, and I was welcomed in. The room was small and hot due to poor air circulation. It smelled like perspiration and metal with a hint of bleach and Windex. My father, I'm sure, despised the whirl of incompatible chemicals. I couldn't take it anymore, but I swallowed my pride and sat in the only metal chair available. He sauntered in a few moments later, on the other side of the plexiglass wall. Although his eyes were fixed on the floor, I could see indications of age on his face, no doubt from tension and time spent near mildew walls. I leaned forward and took the phone. I waited for him to follow suit. He finally looked at me when he did. So many years have passed. We had so many memories together. And one more thing. Do you want to know where I hide the 7th body? I began.